This is the Metal Gateway Podcast.
Welcome back. This is the Metal Gateway Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Sibley. And yeah, it's been a little bit since we had some episodes. It's been actually a couple years. I'm a little embarrassed about that. But I kept working on this show the whole time. It's just, like I said before, this is a labor of love. I'm not doing this for money. So the episodes come out when they come out. And I get episode interviews done when I can do them and when people agree to sit down with me, because I do all these interviews face to face. So it sometimes involves me traveling or being at a festival or whatever. So sometimes things take a little while to get done. But I'm back, and I've got a new episode for you. The first official episode of Season 2 is my conversation today with my old friend Carl Kumpe. I'll get to that in a minute. The first thing I want to say at the beginning of this is I want to highlight that I am just filled when I think about this show with a sense of gratitude, because when I started this show, I was just a dude with an idea. I was like some guy who had this idea that I wanted to talk to people about how they got into metal. And I wasn't really sure that anybody would say yes to this project. I wasn't sure that anybody would agree to sit down and give me their time to tell me their story. I wasn't sure if it was going to ever amount to anything other than maybe just me occasionally interviewing some friends of mine. I'd never imagined that I would be able to sit down with the kind of people that I've been able to sit down with so far. I sort of dreamed that at one point maybe I would sit down with the occasional musician, but I figured mostly it would just be random fans like me. And as it turns out, it's been kind of the exact opposite. I've started asking musicians and they started saying yes, as you saw with last season. So I started being able to, interview some people who have done some really, really cool and impressive things and talk about how they got into metal. And it's just been great. And I'm just so grateful because even though this started just with me and a couple microphones and an idea, fast forward a couple years and, thousands of people have streamed the various episodes of the first season. I've only got one season out. There's, I think a total of 13 or 14 episodes total so far. And thousands of people have streamed these episodes, and the people I've approached asking to be on the show have just continued to get more and more interesting to me, more and more fascinating. I'm able to sort of approach, bigger, more prominent bands, and so I've got some things coming up that are pretty exciting. So I'm really excited about that. So I just wanted to take this moment to thank everybody who's been involved with the project, everybody who's streamed it, even if you've only ever streamed one episode. I just thank you for doing that, because this is kind of amazing to me that, I just sort of put this out there and it's just a labor of love. I'm not doing this for money, and I'm never going to do this for money. It's just purely going to be, you're never going to hear an advertisement on this podcast. I'll make that promise to you right now. So just thanks. I'm just really grateful. If you've, participated in the show, if you sat down for an interview, if you've listened to an episode, if you've told a friend about the show, I'm just grateful for you. So thanks. Anyway, today's episode is an interview I did actually a couple years ago now. This is one of the first episodes I interviewed for this season. But it was a conversation I had with my friend Carl Kumpe. Carl and I met in high school in Denver, Colorado in the mid-1980s. He was one of the first people I met at my new high school because he saw me on the first or second day of school, and I was wearing, I think I was wearing a Megadeth shirt or something. And he saw me wearing some band t-shirt, and he introduced myself, and we've just been friends ever since. And we later ended up forming a death metal band that became known as Psychotic Society. Don't bother looking for it, though. We never recorded anything. But the two other guys besides me and Carl who were in that band were John Kennedy, our guitarist, and Matt Jacobson, who later went on to start Relapse Records. And I interviewed Matt on season 1. So I'd recommend go listen to that episode if you haven't listened to it yet. It was an interesting conversation. But anyway, I sat down with Carl to talk about his Metal Gateway, and we ended up talking for quite a while. This is, I think, probably will be the longest episode of season 1 based on the recordings I have in the can at this point. But one of the things I take away from this conversation, and why I included an interview with an old friend again like I did last season, is because of this. When it comes to music discovery, which is at least ostensibly what this show is supposed to be about, it's really hard to overstate the importance of our friends. I was introduced to so much great music because of my friends like Carl, and at least anecdotally, most of the people I've interviewed for this show have told me similar stories about their friends and the bands, the scenes, the experiences they discovered because of their friends. So, music bonds us together and gives us common ground. And I just think that's a really important thing to highlight in the context of this show. So you'll hear Carl and I telling old stories about how our band came to be and some of the shows we went to together and records we listened to. But Carl also talks, I think quite interestingly actually, about the connection between the metal scene and the hardcore punk scene from a personal point of view as someone who lived in both camps, both as a musician and as a fan. So I think that's an interesting conversation too, because we haven't talked a lot about hardcore on this show so far, and I think there's a lot of common ground and a lot of commonality and a lot of crossover between those two scenes that I think Carl explores that stuff pretty interestingly here. So anyway, enjoy the conversation, and once again, thank you so much for listening. Carl, what was your gateway, man?
Okay.
What was the first experience you had, the first exposure you had to metal? How did it start?
Well, yeah, first of all, thanks a lot for having me here. We're really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too, man.
So if I was to talk about how I got into metal, I'd have to preface that with how I got into what I would term just sound.
Yeah.
And I recall when I was young that my father has collected music for a long time and is a huge fan of music, and obviously left an imprint on me. He was a big fan of the Beatles and would play Beatles all the time. And as a kid, I recall one album in particular, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and the song A Day in the Life. And the song is a 2-part song. And in the middle of it, the Beatles were probably out of their mind on drugs by this point. And they were like experimenting in the studio with sound and noise. And there's all this panning and these random, not really samples, but they were just making noise in the studio.
Yeah.
And it was just meant as a break between these 2 parts of the song,
right,
before the piano intro kicks in on the second part. But I was fascinated by this middle part, and particularly what I demanded my father did was put this record on, turn the sound all the way up, and turn the lights off. And I would sit in the middle of the living room.
How old are you at this point?
I was young. I don't know, 7, 6, 7.
So you were a little kid. Yeah.
But I recall that moment where I could sit in the room and sort of in sensory, isolation, and wait for that part to hit, that, all the hair would stand up on the back of my neck and I would feel overwhelmed and I felt helpless. And I was fascinated by it. I felt like it was so much bigger than me. And I think that moment really set, the groundwork for what I was looking for in sound and experience. And so, a few years later, I spent the night at my friend Guy Murphy's house, who lived down the street, and his older brother Sage was like the bad heavy metal kid in middle school.
Right.
And I think, so Guy and I went to the same elementary school, and I had heard the term heavy metal. I have heard people talking about it, but it was a vague notion to me. I just didn't really know what it was. But Guy and I were in his room and we were having a conversation about heavy metal. It was probably this ridiculous, ill-informed conversation, but Sage overheard us and he came into the room and said, "Do you want to know what real heavy metal is?" And I looked at Sage and I was like, yes, I do.
I can see this guy. I've never met him, but I can see it in my mind,
Huge figure in my life, Sage Murphy.
Yeah.
So he takes me down to his,
shout out to Sage Murphy.
Shout out to Sage.
Yes.
Follow him down to his room, and he puts on the first Black Sabbath album. I didn't know it was Black Sabbath at the time, and cues it up, and rain starts falling.
Yeah.
and there's some sort of spooky noises, and then that chord hits, and
we all know the chord.
Yeah, and the devil's note, and all the hair stands up on the back of my neck again. And I knew at that moment that I was going to listen to this for the rest of my life. Like, that was it.
Yeah.
And it just hit so hard. And, when I look at sort of my career of listening to heavy music generally, I think that that's always been the barometer for me, that the stuff that makes my hair stand up on the back of my neck. And I trace that back to the Beatles and to Black Sabbath. And so I was very fortunate to have Sage sort of be the one who introduced me to all this stuff, because I never had a kind of a lame, evolutionary period or figuring out, fumbling in the dark, random stuff. He immediately introduced me to Judas Priest, to Iron Maiden. And so I sort of had this built-in start of just like what was cool, what was evil, and what was heavy. And, I think from there, it was really just a desire to accumulate knowledge and learn more about the stuff, learn as much as I could about this. And I think at the time, the best, source for that kind of stuff, with music magazines. Mm-hmm. There weren't really music magazines in America that covered heavy metal. Heavy metal wasn't really a respected musical genre in, the early 80s, at least when it comes to journalism.
It certainly wasn't taken seriously on that level. No.
Now, there was, Circus Magazine, and there was Hit Parader.
Uh-huh.
And they would, I did, one of the bands that I came to on my own was Motley Crue. Because, and I will absolutely defend those first two Motley Crue albums as
me too.
Some of the best, hard rock and leaning into metal that there ever was.
Yeah, for sure.
And so, whether if these magazines would cover Motley Crue, I would definitely buy whatever that the Circus or Hit Parader was.
Right.
And that led me then to this whole world that was in the back of these magazines, that you had these black and white ads for these really sort of esoteric, weird sounding labels like Metal Blade Records or Megaforce or Neat. And even though it was in black and white and very small pictures, the thumbnails of these record covers were so intriguing because they were so different and so outside of what I had seen. I mean, obviously, Iron Maiden had awesome album covers. And
right.
Judas Priest looked pretty awesome too.
Yeah. But they were established major label bands at that point.
They absolutely were. Yeah. And I think that seeing this other stuff that seemed just a bit more transgressive, like a little bit dirtier, like a little bit odd.
Well, and the thing I think that's interesting about that time period with the band or magazines like Circus and Hit Parader is that the journalistic content of those magazines was not covering anything that was not already established.
Absolutely.
Right? They were only covering bands like Motley Crue, who were well known, and they were really just reporting on what was going on with those bands. They were not uncovering, they were not digging around in the underground.
I don't think they were there to break new bands.
No, but you're right that there were these like the savvy underground labels in the early days of Metal Blade and Megaforce and all those that you mentioned, right? Probably Combat. And they understood that this is where our audience is. And if we want to break some of these, if we want to get attention for these, emerging bands, like we need to tap into, because there wasn't really many other outlets. Like, as you said earlier, there was not really any other outlets.
No, for a kid, that was it. I mean, there was word of mouth, but
right.
At my elementary school, the when it came to like hard rock or metal, people were about, Def Leppard and stuff. And again, this was, I think like by the time I was in 5th, 6th grade, Pyromania was sort of the thing.
Yep.
And that's a great album, but I wanted something harder. I wanted something heavier. And so my friends weren't really on this same journey I was. And so finding these ads in Circus and Hit Parader was an eye opener for me. And then actually starting to purchase with whatever money I was able to get some of these albums just based on album cover at this point.
Yeah.
Took a few flyers on some
just
early
mail order.
Megaforce. There was a shopping center, Bear Valley, that was like the closest civilization to Morrison back in those days in Sheridan,
right.
Sheridan, Colorado. And there was a bookstore there, Columbine Books and Records, and they had this one little section that said imports. And and they weren't all imports, because some of these things were, they was like Metal Blade or Megaforce. But anyway, It was all in the import section, and it was all this weird metal stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of the weird metal stuff I had seen in the magazines was in this one section, in this random bookstore in the Sheridan neighborhood of Denver. And so I got a couple of records there. And that's when I figured out how thanks lists worked. And so then if I got lucky and bought an album that had a pretty cool cover and the record turned out to be good, I could think of one. And if I think of like a Pandemonium, that heavy metal band from Alaska that had Heavy Metal Soldiers, I think it was. I bought that on Metal Blade, and I really liked that record, still do. But anyway, looking at the thanks list, all the bands that they liked and they thought were cool and they would play with, that became a bit of a shopping list. And I thought, if these guys think this is cool, I'll go find that. And when I was done with sixth grade, I ended up going to a new school, in the school where we ultimately met.
Right.
And, I was kind of an outcast in the sense that I was an athlete, but I was also, really into Dungeons and Dragons and liked heavy metal. And I always felt, like odd or different. I was into.
You were in two worlds.
I was kind of into nerd stuff. Like, that stuff was not cool,
right,
in 1984 at a private school in Denver.
Right.
So I felt a little odd. Anyway, I remember in art class, though, I met this other kid who seemed kind of odd. And that was Gene O'Neill. And Gene had actually been on a similar journey to me. He had seen these ads in Circus and Hit Parade, and he knew about these bands and he knew about these labels, and he had started to experiment with buying stuff based, on cover and then looking deeper. And he had his mother lived in Lakewood, Green Mountain, and there was a record store there called JB&H Records that he told me about, and that they had a really big section on metal. So I remember, doing sleepovers at Gene's house, and we could walk to JB&H.
Yeah.
I think it was like a mile and a half, 2 miles from his house. So we just walked there. But that became, I guess when the gates really opened, because then here was this store that had all of these records that I had seen in the magazines and a lot of stuff I had not seen. And that really, opened, many doors there in terms of stuff I was able to explore. And another thing I think that...
Do you remember any specific albums that you bought in that?
Oh, absolutely.
At that time?
I think of Haunting the Chapel.
Oh, sure.
The Armored Saint EP, the 3-song. Fate's Warning, Night on Brocken. War and Pain, Voivod. That...
I just think about the idea of the mindset today. I think about what it must have sounded like to listen to the War and Pain album in 1984.
Oh, it sounded so noisy and chaotic. And I remember,
I love that album so much.
I do too. Yeah. And it's funny because that album was that was kind of Gene's album.
Yeah. He loved
He would sing the praises of War and Pain, and then Slayer sort of became my band.
Yeah.
And so that's, we had, unofficially, I guess, settled on our bands, our mascots, and he got Voivod, I got Slayer.
Yeah.
Another thing that was really important, I think, in my musical development at JB&H were that they carried a lot of metal magazines I hadn't seen before, and that was Kerrang was one of those, and then Metal Forces was another one. And those ended up being pretty big in my musical development as well, because here were magazines that really did cover metal and quite extensively, and a lot of stuff that, again, I had not heard of.
Stuff that was outside the mainstream.
Right, and they were writing about it, Metal Forces to a greater extent than Kerrang. But I don't want to dismiss Kerrang's importance, in my musical development. And so sometimes it was a matter of choosing, do I get these, they were overpriced, of course, because they were imports from England. Do I get this magazine or do I get this record?
Right.
That was always these decisions to be made.
Now, would they let you flip through the magazines, or were they in plastic?
They were behind a case. They were in a glass case. So I sort of had to look at the cover and just decide that's going to be the one, and take a flyer on it.
Yeah, based on whatever the bands that were listed on the cover.
But yeah, JB&H was enormous, crucial in my musical development. And I think then what happened in probably the summer between 7th and 8th grade is really when I got into skateboarding.
Uh-huh.
And again, hard to overestimate skateboarding's importance to me personally, my world outlook, physically, and then also musically. And I say that because I discovered Thrasher magazine. And I think that I had saw that one of the punk rock kids at CA had a Thrasher.
Yeah.
And I just thought the name sounded cool because thrash metal was sort of, I know it had, probably had its start around 83, 84, but, in this like, this is about 85, 86 that I was really enthralled with skateboarding. And
Sure.
I just thought this name looked awesome. And this magazine just had this kind of fuck you attitude, and it really appealed. And within Thrasher magazine, there was a music column written by this guy, Brian Schroeder, who then I later learned was the artist Pusshead. But at the time I just, he had Puss Zone was his column, and he would write this very florid prose. And I always appreciated, I think I didn't, at the time I didn't recognize it, but I think later in life I look back that I always appreciated music writers who would get me excited if I would read their work and I would want to listen to that thing. They described it in such a manner that I thought, I have to hear this. This sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
And Schroeder had this florid prose, a bazillion adjectives, and this very distinctive style of writing, but it got me super excited about a lot of really cool different bands. And this stuff was harder to find. I did mail order some of this stuff, but then I think that some point around there, Gene and I had learned about this store, Wax Trax, in Denver. And that was like the punk rock store in our area. And we were able to go to Wax Trax, and they had this stuff, some of the stuff that was in Thrasher. And so I was able to get that. And then
we were so lucky.
Yeah. I think it was
Wax Trax.
Wonderful time for us to have grown up and where we grew up too. And that Wax Trax was such a fundamental part of both of our musical journeys, being able to have that kind of culture and that center, that hub to so close, and to just learn so much from that place. Because, there were flyers for all these different shows, and there were cool magazines and zines. That's really where I started to learn about that stuff.
That was the first place I ever saw an issue of Maximum Rock and Roll.
Oh yeah.
Was on the counter.
Yeah.
I think they used to just keep them on the counter.
They did.
Yeah. And, we used to just go there and just, flip through the
we
stacks.
spent a long time there. Yeah.
Yeah. And just, looking at everything and like, wow, and saving our pennies and, thinking about, I think about it now, like without that record store, I would not have had exposure to so many bands that are still so important to me. I mean, all the earache stuff, Carcass, Entombed, Morbid Angel, like all that stuff.
Yeah,
I discovered because of Wax Trax.
They were absolutely hip to it from the beginning.
And I don't know if it's because they had distribution, like they must have had some sort of connection to earache, because the earache stuff at that time, like, would not have showed up at like Sam Goody or wherever.
Oh, absolutely not.
No. Like, so somehow Wax Trax had, I would love to go back and like talk to whoever it was that was running things back then.
Yeah.
It's like, how did you guys do it? Because I think it must have, pre-internet, it must have been really unusual for an obscure little record store in a place like Denver, Colorado, to be getting pretty much all the earache stuff pretty much right away.
Well, and maybe it's because earache back then had some, cachet and with the punk scene.
Could have been.
And they were definitely a punk label to begin with.
Yep.
Hardcore and grindcore, but they had that punk appeal. And I think that was Wax Trax's mission, really, was to spread, the gospel of punk and weirdo outsider type art. And early earache certainly fit into that.
Yeah. Anyway, so I'm sorry for the sidetrack there,
okay.
but yeah, we had that. We were really lucky to have Wax Trax. Is my main point. Anyway, you were saying.
So, from Wax Trax, I guess, and skateboarding leading into Wax Trax and learning then about all of this new music, it was just a constant search for And that really began, in Sage's bedroom of that Black Sabbath hitting, but then also of discovery when he showed me all this other stuff that was so cool that I wanted to find what was next. And I wanted to find something heavier, faster, more evil, whatever it was, just to keep going and to keep finding this stuff, because it was just this exciting time of discovery. And I think that that's something that I've carried through even into, my elder years, is this desire for discovery and this desire to find stuff that maybe they're touchstones to stuff I've heard before that with which I'm comfortable, but also that takes me somewhere else, that does something else with it. And some of the stuff too that I don't necessarily like, right? When I first hear it, I don't get it. Yeah. And I think back to when I bought that Haunting the Chapel EP. Right. So I was, a tad late to Slayer. I didn't start with Show No Mercy. Haunting the Chapel was my first thing, and
we'll let it slide.
It was so fast, and that I didn't know if I liked it when I first heard it. It was odd, but I think then it stuck with me, and I kept listening to it, and that became an imprint of how metal and thrash metal is sort of supposed to sound to me. Was that Haunting the Chapel EP and Slayer's version of thrash metal, and there's certainly been other, thrash, and I reference thrash metal because I think that was when I look at, Black Sabbath hitting hard, thrash metal was another one of those moments of real sea change for me, that this was like, I was way into this. This is, I'm a thrasher. Right. And I wanted all things thrash. Yeah. And then I think that happened again with death metal. That happened, I think, certain points with hardcore, but there are certain genres I think that have really, I would call my wheelhouse, that the ones that were periods in my evolution where I could point to, here's the thrash period, here's the death metal period. And thrash was definitely one of the first big ones.
Right. At what point did you start going to shows? And what were some of your earliest live concert memories that really stick with you?
So very fortunate that my parents have always been very supportive of my musical journeys and all the weird, frankly, off-putting stuff that I was listening to as a kid. They were totally cool with that. And as a matter of fact,
I'm going to sing your mom's praises later.
Yeah.
But we'll go ahead.
So the first concert I ever went to, my father took my brother and I to McNichols Sports Arena in Denver to see Ozzy on the Bark at the Moon tour with Motley Crue opening, and they were doing Shout at the Devil.
Damn.
And
that's a concert.
It was, so what was that, 80? I think that was March of 84.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And so I was 11.
I think, I was going to say, I think Shout at the Devil came out in fall of 83. So they would have been touring it the following spring, probably. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So I was 11 years old. My brother was what, 8 or 9.
8 or 9. And you guys are at Ozzy and Motley Crue.
Yeah. And I remember my mom put us in these yellow t-shirts. There was this, some European clothing company, was like Paris Match. It had this red logo on these yellow t-shirts, and she dressed us exactly the same. And I remember sitting, in these seats with my father, and it was just so loud, so crushing, overwhelming. We didn't have earplugs. We didn't know. I mean, we'd never been to a concert before. My father had never probably been to a rock concert like this. And, people were passing weed, and it ruined me in the sense of, I want this. Again, there was that feeling of being overwhelmed, right? Yeah. The sound and the spectacle of the thing.
Yeah.
Ozzy had this great stage show. Motley Crue was fantastic. They were one of my favorite bands at that point. So that was it. That set me down the path. And then in 7th grade, the next show I went to was Grim Reaper. The British band, the first tour they did in America, See You in Hell. Uh-huh. They played at the Rainbow Music Hall, and I went with Gene. I think his stepmom, Debbie. She took us. Very cool of her, and again, that was so cool. And And that was, more of an underground thing, right? I mean, Grim Reaper was one of those bands that, I had discovered through ads in Circus, and that cover of that record, See You in Hell, is just, it's evil.
That is a band I haven't thought about in a long time.
Yeah, so that was my second concert, and Jag Panzer from Colorado Springs opened up. They were great. And then next, Gene's dad took us to Stryper. We saw Stryper at the Rainbow again, and I remember, like, Stryper was great. They were very pro. They were really good at what they did. But I recall that, I guess I had, by this point, I'd been to 2 concerts, right? So I was an old pro, and I knew, like, what was supposed to happen at concerts. And there were all these people who would sit down between songs while Stryper was playing. And I thought, like, how lame is this? Like, there's just no energy. Like, people are sitting down. Like, you stand the whole concert.
Yeah, what's this about?
And what's going on? And they had these 2 signs on each side of the stage. One was a circle, a red circle with a black 666 in it and the red line through it.
Yeah, right.
And the other one was an upside down cross with the red line through
it.
Right. And I remember thinking, as a kid, even looking at this, thinking, this is so lame. Like, it just felt neutered.
Right.
And I mean, it was fun. It was an important developmental thing for me, but it was also when I realized I want evil in my music. I don't want to go to Christian metal shows.
I will give credit to Stryper, though. That band does have some really good riffs.
They absolutely do. And they had this wonderful yellow and black thing going on at that point.
Yep. Very theatrical.
Even, Robert Sweet's drums were all yellow and black. His drum cage.
All the guitars were yellow and black.
Yeah, they were so everything. Pro, and it was extremely well done. Very pro band. I probably shouldn't talk shit about Stryper. I own Stryper albums, but
no, I don't sit around listening to Stryper, but I definitely like they were on my radar as well. Right around that time, and I've never actually seen them live, but yes, I like definitely. In a certain way, they were an important band for me. Really, not because of the Christian thing at all, just because I was like, damn, these riffs are fucking great. Like,
yeah, agreed.
There's some, that especially on the Soldiers Under Command record, there's just some fucking fantastic guitar riffs on there, and it was well produced, and it was just well done.
Yeah, it was. I think they were a legitimate heavy metal band
for sure.
There wasn't. I think it was.
They're still doing it too,
and they still are. And they sound great, probably live.
Yeah,
I think it was just the aesthetic, right?
Yeah, I
think that I was starting to become conditioned to what the heavy metal aesthetic, or at least in my mind, should look like, and how a band should present themselves, and that it was seeing the Stryper show was jarring because
it's pretty clean.
And people were sitting down.
Yeah.
And it didn't feel dangerous.
Yeah.
There was not, and I guess maybe that was part of the thing, is maybe that was part of the appeal of heavy metal, was the danger, the feeling that, shit could pop off at any moment, and that was exciting, that was maybe one of the things that attracted me to it, and probably still does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's definitely always been that I think that element of danger that is what's a big part of what's fun about it for me even today. And it's just, I don't know, it's just funny to have gone, I mean, I've been to hundreds of shows at this point, and it's like there's still that, even I'm 52 years old, and there's still like this kid in me every time the pit just starts going nuts or whatever.
Sure.
And I happen to be right next to it or something, and you're like, you can just feel that energy, even if you can't see it, even if it's happening behind you. You're like, I'm aware that this is happening, and it's like, I still, every time I feel like I'm 16 years old again. It doesn't,
right.
And it just, and the other night I was at the Opeth show, and I was talking to some, I end up talking to people because I'm a chatty guy, as everyone who's met me knows. One of the guys was like, man, he was like in his 30s. He's like, I just feel like I'm getting too old for this. And I turned around and I was like, nah. I was like, you're not. I said, first of all, I was like, I'm 52 years old. And I was like, I'm going to keep coming until they have to wheel me in here.
Yep.
And I absolutely am. Like, there's just because there's nothing like it. There's nothing like it. There's no feeling like being at a metal show to me.
No. And I cannot imagine not, doing this and not being into this stuff, not going to shows, not seeking out new music, not going to record stores, not talking to people about this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I love it.
Yeah.
And, I have no intention of stopping.
Yeah. So that gives us most of the backstory. And then that takes us to the point where, you and I have met now at this point.
Yep.
And it wasn't long after that I sort of realized that, I think I had wanted to be in a band, and because I had been into metal long enough by that point that I was like, I feel like I could sort of try my hand at this. But I had no idea how to go about doing that.
Right.
And then at some point you and I just started having this conversation, and I learned that you were a drummer.
Uh-huh.
And I had a guitar at that point, but I think I must have also had the bass at some point. But anyway, so we ended up, and I think I told this story because now that I've interviewed you,
right,
there's only one person from our band left for me to interview. I need to interview John.
Yeah. And
it's funny because John has come up on other interviews because there's people like in Philly who know John and have worked with John on various projects. Cool. So anyway, so it's just interesting. So I'm going to interview John at some point, but I think what's interesting about that is that, the story about how we like formed that first band and how we met Matt and John.
Yep.
Is a funny one, and I've told it, but I'm interested in. I'd like you to tell that story about how that happened because, I think it's fun to hear the story about how this silly band that we did that we played 3 shows I think in our entire, maybe 2 in our entire existence.
Yeah, that's right.
We never recorded anything or released anything, but we were basically just a garage band, a bunch of high school kids. But we've all gone off to do other things in metal, and that's just kind of made me, really happy to know that even though we had this weird beginning, that we've all done these different things over the years. So anyway, tell me about what your memories are of like us forming that band and putting together what became known as Psychotic Society. Which I still think to this day, by the way, is a great name for like, we should start a band again, and like we should it's a crust name or something. It should be a crust band.
It works as a crust. I think it could also work for like an old school thrash band, like a crossover band.
We could do
works.
That too. But that's not what we were trying to do because we weren't smart enough.
We
were trying to be Napalm Death.
I think that what had happened was you and I don't know even did we play together like just bass and drums or guitar and
we might have, yeah.
Maybe we had played a little bit together.
And Gene might have been involved in some way because Gene also had a guitar.
Yeah, Gene had a guitar. Anyway, so it would all happen at my house because that's where the drum set was, and my parents were cool with it. I remember you excitedly calling me one day and said that you found this flyer that you had to show me. You were in Pro Sound.
What's funny is I remember it the other way around. I remember that you found the flyer.
Okay, that's interesting. One of us found the flyer, excitedly contacted the other one and said, so there are these 2 guys, apparently a singer and a guitarist, looking for a bassist and a drummer.
And we were like, we're a bassist and a drummer.
Right. And so they said they wanted to form this band called Incessant Mutilation. And I remember the name sounded so ridiculous. I thought it was kind of dumb, but it was also kind of awesome. And the artwork on the flyer was really striking.
Yeah.
And so it was something John had drawn. And so I called John. You got one of the tabs off of this thing. I called the number. It was John Kennedy, and we started talking about music. And so I think he was testing me, and I was like, passing because I was mentioning the right stuff. And mostly it was Napalm Death. I think I had discovered Napalm Death in Pus Zone in Thrasher and the Peel Sessions. I bought it when I was on a trip in Germany. I found it in a record store, and I got it. And that was just a devastating barrage at that time. And so I really learned how to do blast beats listening to Mick Harris on
that Peel Sessions.
That Peel Sessions EP. So John on the phone call asked me if I could do blast beats. And so I put the phone next to the drum set and just started blasting away. And which must have sounded just god awful. And I picked up the phone again, and John said, "Fuck yeah."
Yeah.
And it was exciting because, I got it. Right.
Yeah, right.
I understood the assignment.
Yeah,
And,
right.
So then I think literally you came to my house and John and Matt drove to my house. And that was the first time we met them.
I went and picked them up because neither
did
of
you?
them had a car at that point.
Okay. So you brought
Yeah.
all of you to my house. And that
And
was the first time we met them.
Yeah, that was the first time we met them. And the reason, so for everyone who's listening, like I grew up on one side of Denver. Carl grew up on the far other side of town. And the school that we went to was kind of roughly in the middle. And the side of town that I was on was not far from the same side of town that John and Matt were on. They went to a different high school. And so because I was on the same side of town, I went over and picked them up. But yeah, the first time I met John, I remember it was a snowy day and he had given me directions to his house. And then I picked him up first and then we went and picked up Matt.
Okay.
And I had a 1974 VW Bug.
Yeah.
And somehow we fit
Oh yeah.
my bass amp, John's guitar and guitar amp, and me and Matt and John
Yeah.
in that car. I have no idea how we got all that shit in there.
Awesome.
And then we just drove up to your place.
Yep.
And yeah, we pulled up and they got out and you were like, hey, nice to meet you. So, and then we just sort of started jamming, I guess.
I think we started jamming, but I think that it also ended up those trips you guys would make to my house ended up being this bonding experience because I remember you guys would bring records with you and we spent an awful lot of time in my room listening to music.
Yep.
And introducing each other to new stuff. And there was definitely a lot of stuff that John and Matt brought to the table that you and I were not familiar with.
Yep.
And that definitely expanded our horizons.
But it flowed in all directions.
It did. And absolutely, there was stuff I think that they got from us, that they didn't know about.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of one thing in particular was one of the random discoveries for me from Thrasher magazine was Big Black. And specifically it was the Atomizer album.
Yep.
And I just remember reading a review about it, and it wasn't in Pus Zone, it was in the regular record reviews, but it sounded so interesting. And that was one I got at JB&H that ended up being a really important, I think, opened up the door for stuff that was, and I wouldn't call Big Black a heavy band, maybe heavy subject matter, but they were really caustic. They were really pretty transgressive and aggressive and really confrontational, punk in a different way.
Yeah.
And that really appealed. And I remember John and Matt were really into Big Black, after I played it really loud on my stereo with the bass going, it made sense to them. But yeah, we there was a lot of back and forth. I remember we would make home movies and stuff. My brother would be involved. And yeah, it was a cool bonding time we had there for a couple of years of hanging out with those guys. And
one of the things that I remember so much about it that is so, about those times just sitting around listening was, that sense of discovery. Because we would get excited, like, I'd have a record or John would have a record, or Matt would have a record, and we'd bring them to practice and be like, okay, you guys got to hear this.
Right.
And it was just like this, like this really cool, sharing thing where, I think about it now and it's like, oh yeah, it's so easy for me to just like text you a link on Spotify to like hear a new song. But I would like wait all week for band practice.
We'd be all
I'd bring
excited.
this record and I'm like, I'm going to put this on Carl's turntable and we're going to listen to this and you guys are going to be like, have your minds blown or whatever.
Yep.
And I just remember there's some bands that I remember that I still think about every time I listen to them. I still think about the first time I heard it was in your bedroom at band practice. So the ones that I love still to this day, the first Bolt Thrower album.
In Battle There's No Lie. I think John brought that.
Yeah, I think so too. And I had never heard anything that heavy.
Yeah.
Like, holy shit. And it's a shame that it's the only Bolt Thrower album that's not on Spotify.
Yeah.
Because it's so good. And so, yeah, in Battle There Is No Law.
I would say Macabre.
Grim
is Reality.
I was just going to say Macabre Grim Reality
When we
is,
heard that
is a
speed.
I was like,
I
I've
remember
never
all
heard...
of us, our jaws dropped.
Yeah.
With just that how fast the guitar riff was, but then the drums matched it.
Yeah.
We're like, how do they play so fast?
Like, we had no idea how.
Yeah.
Like, how. I just remember thinking, holy shit.
Macabre all blew our minds.
Yeah, Macabre. And then, like, hearing bands like Entombed and Morbid Angel in your bedroom for the first time was like, the first time I heard Altars of Madness.
Okay.
Was like,
Yeah, that was a Wax Trax purchase.
Yeah, that was you had bought that, and
Yeah.
you brought it. You were like, you guys, you got to hear this, And it was like, oh fuck, and because that was around the time the Grind Crusher had come out, and so I think actually the first time I heard Morbid Angel was actually Grind Crusher, not Altars of Madness. I mean, the song
Chapel of Ghouls.
Chapel of Ghouls was on that. I think that was the opening track on Grind Crusher.
Sounds right.
Yeah, I think it was. So that's where I heard Morbid Angel for the first time was Grind Crusher, because we listened. And that was also the first time I heard Entombed.
Okay.
And I had heard Carcass before. I had heard Bolt Thrower before. But what were some of the other bands on Grind Crusher? I mean, that was a hugely pivotal. And Joe and I talked about this on his episode.
There's like Filthy Christians, Unseen Terror. Old Lady Drivers.
OLD.
Yeah, back with
Colostomy Grab Bag.
Yeah.
Yeah. Such a great track.
Yep.
Spastic Blur.
Yes. The Wehrmacht guys.
Yeah, the Wehrmacht guys. So anyway, those are just great memories, and the discovery was great too, but also the anticipation of sharing that stuff with you guys was a huge part of the experience for me.
And it's wonderful to hear. And I actually I just want to backtrack, or I guess expand here. I think one of the things that allowed us to do that and spend all this time listening to this ridiculous music and playing, in my parents' garage, was that my parents were so tolerant, not just tolerant, I would say really celebrated the things that my brother and I cared about. And as an example, I remember when Slayer was doing their South of Heaven tour. And, back in those days, they would sell the tickets at various outlets, and you had to go line up there and everything. Yep. And so, of course, this was when we were in school, and like we couldn't go, line up,
take the day off
and line up. I mean, I'm sure a lot of other, Hessians did, but we did not. We were good kids. And so my mom, who's Bavarian and quite proper, put on her Bavarian finery and stood in line with all these Slayer fans at Bear Valley at that Columbine Books and Records
to buy the tickets,
waiting to buy tickets for my brother and I. And I just it's one of those memories I look back and think about, like how cool, like my mom doesn't care about Slayer, but she knew that, I did.
Right. And
that it was important to me. And so my mom stood in line with these, terrifying, filthy Slayer fans and got those tickets for my brother and I. And that's huge. And it's just very meaningful. And so I think it was that, I definitely have to give a shout out to how wonderful it was to have parents that were so supportive of the things about which I cared.
Yeah. And they really did. And this is why I said earlier I wanted to sing your mom's praises in particular, because I didn't spend nearly as much time with your dad. But, when we would have band practice at your house, your mom was always there.
Yes.
Like always.
Yep.
And so she's upstairs. We're in the garage. And I remember even back then thinking, she's up there listening to this
racket
cacophony coming from downstairs. Because, I mean, I wish we had recorded something, because I would love to actually share it on the show so that people have a sense of this, because I've talked about the band before on different episodes. But, for anybody who hadn't had the pleasure of seeing us, which is all of you, because we only played 2 shows ever. Basically, I think, feel free to disagree with me here, but I think essentially what we were trying to do was like the death grind thing that Napalm Death was doing really well. Like we really wanted to emulate that.
Yeah, I think so.
And more than anything else, we definitely had plenty of other influences, but we really loved that sound, like particularly of the from Enslavement to Obliteration and Scum era Napalm Death.
Yeah, or Repulsion.
Repulsion.
I think we were trying. That was the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, whether we were successful or not,
right. So imagine if you will, you're Carl's mother, you're, as he said, Bavarian.
Yes.
And fairly proper.
Yes, very, very.
And there's 4, 16-year-old boys in the garage of your house playing music that is trying to sound like Napalm Death, but nowhere near as good as what Napalm Death was doing.
Napalm Death, yes.
Yes, it was incompetent Napalm Death. I'm just trying to imagine what her mindset would, she's like sitting there like with a cup of tea or something and going, what in the fuck are these guys playing? Like this is, but she was supportive of it, and she was just always there and always positive and would feed us and
made us meals all the time and would talk to you guys and learn about your lives and and ask me questions and ask me questions about you guys, and still, to this day, if I mention that I'm going to see Brian, I'm going to hang out with Brian, talk to him, she gets excited about it. And,
Oh, cool.
And similarly with Matt and John is always asking me what all of you were doing and where you're living and and they obviously you made an impression on them as well.
Yeah. Well, it's just great because it was such good memories of those days, and I think anybody who was in a band in high school probably has some similar stories that they could tell about the people that were
Sure.
within earshot of practice going.
Yeah.
Whether they were metal fans or not, probably going, what in the fuck is going on in that garage?
Yeah.
That sounds awful. And there were times that it probably honestly sounded awful to us too, right?
I'm sure. We were learning. We were figuring this stuff out, and
we had really bad equipment. You had a nice drum set. But we did not have we didn't top end amplifiers.
Not professional gear.
No, not professional gear at all. So it was the gear could fit with 3 guys in a 74 VW Buck.
Right.
So it was not professional gear.
Well,
anyway.
And then, we went to a lot of shows together, the 4 of us. I think shows that ultimately ended up being really important, I would say, and certainly in my development, I would think, particularly of when the 4 of us saw the Scared Straight tour with Accused and Brotherhood.
Mm-hmm.
That's when I had referenced before that I felt always a little odd, a bit of an outsider. I was an athlete, but I liked skateboarding. I liked role-playing games. I liked heavy metal, and there was all this sort of nerd stuff or deliberate stuff that sort of puts you at odds with the mainstream. And
especially back at that time, right? If you had an identity that was I'm an athlete,
sure,
and an identity that I'm into D&D and,
right, I'm a gaming
metal,
nerd, that's
and then you had a separate identity as a skateboarder. Those things were in very many high schools in this country, completely incompatible with each other,
just incongruent.
Yeah, you're somebody's going to be trying to beat you up after
absolutely
school.
There's always a tension I think you feel because you realize that you don't fit, you're different. And
you don't fit entirely in any one of those. You have a foot in each.
I guess you're never quite comfortable.
Right.
Or you're never at ease enough to truly be yourself, to let everything down. And when Brotherhood came out onto the stage, I remember they looked like the varsity football team. They had all this sports gear on. They were big dudes. And I thought, what is this?
Yeah, they were fit, and they had hoodies and ball caps,
right,
and they were wearing sneakers, and
so when they started playing, it was just this awesome thrash, and it was just so good, and I was blown away. And I talked to one of these guys who turned out to be Greg Anderson after the show, and said, "What is this thing? What are you doing?" And he said, "We're straight edge. We don't drink, we don't smoke, we keep it positive." And that it hit me. That's it. This is where I belong. This is my group. This is my crew.
Yeah.
And that was a really important, I think, developmental part of my life, because from that show and essentially until I was, 29 years old, I was straight edge.
Yeah.
And so that ended up being a big part of my own identity, but then also discovering, a lot of music that way.
Right.
Really the kind of the straight edge hardcore scene, and ultimately being, playing in straight edge bands and being involved in that scene was another, developmental aspect of my journey through metal. So, and that was something that the 4 of us got to experience, together.
Yeah. And the sort of crossover there between, and, I say crossover kind of jokingly, but also in the context of metal subgenres, I mean it also literally. That genre of crossover thrash was happening around that time. And I feel like, we were definitely in that mix. And then the band that John and I went off and formed after Psychotic Society broke up was solidly a crossover thrash band. And, I just think about that time was the late 80s and early 90s was such an interesting time because you had all these different things in the mix, right? You had a lot of hardcore and punk. You had death metal was definitely a thing by this point. Black metal was a thing by this point. Thrash, certainly. Crossover was, that crossover between hardcore and thrash metal. So you had all these things in the mix, and like there was not this total definition of anything yet in a weird way. It seemed like everything was just grabbing pieces of other things. And you listen to the things now that are like, you listen to the early, most influential black metal albums. You listen to early Venom, you listen to Hellhammer and Celtic Frost. You're like, this isn't black metal the way I know black metal today. This is basically like kind of evil sounding thrash is really what most of it is. Right?
Yeah. I think thrash is the foundation of extreme music.
Yeah.
As we know it.
In a lot of ways. Yeah, for sure. So anyway, I don't know. I don't really think I had a point there. I was just sort of, I guess riffing on this idea that you brought up.
That we were in this exciting time where we were being exposed to all this stuff and we got to experience it together.
Right.
And clearly it had an impact on not just our musical tastes, but our lives really, right?
For sure.
Because, in one way or another, all of us were involved, in the metal scene in some capacity and then remain fans.
Yeah, for sure.
Obviously to this day.
Yeah, we've all certainly done different things.
Yeah.
But yes, it's really an interesting, that was just such an interesting time. And I feel so fortunate that we were able to experience that when it was all like in real time.
Yeah.
We weren't going back to these things. Like we were seeing this stuff evolve in real time. And I think the thing I want to mention that's, I think a good example of that is just the one you just illustrated, which is that Scared Straight tour. Mm-hmm. Let's unpack this for a moment.
Yeah.
That's a weird ass bill.
Very odd.
Okay. You've got The Accused, which is like, what did they call it? They called it like
Splatter rock.
Splatter rock.
Yeah.
That was their thing, right?
And they were a well-established like thrash crossover thrash band by that point.
Sure.
They were on their third album, I think.
Yeah, it was Martha Splatterhead's scariest, maddest stories ever told.
Yeah.
Right. And so they were touring that third album, and then they brought Brotherhood. It was this like straight edge band.
Yeah.
But they were from Seattle. And at that time, if you had an opportunity to go tour with a band that was from your same town, as long as they were sort of at least adjacent to where you were and you could draw a similar fan base, it wasn't weird at all to go out on tour with a band. Because those two bands, I would put them in solidly very different genres in a lot of ways.
They definitely did not hang out together in Seattle.
No, not at all. And so, because like The Accused, like they pulled up to some of their gigs in a hearse and they were like drinking and all this. And, and it was not the straight edge guys, right, at all.
No.
So anyway, I don't know. It was such an interesting thing to see that. And I remember being at that show too and going, man, that was like the first time I'd ever seen, because you had like Nazi skinheads that showed up at that show and got their asses kicked. And I remember like, my jaw was on the floor like, holy shit. During the Brotherhood set, they stopped playing in the middle of the song, dropped their instruments on the stage and like dove into the crowd and beat the shit out of these guys.
Yeah.
And then the Nazis left. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing.
Yeah, that was one of the first instances I think we saw policing the scene.
Yeah,
right?
For sure.
That we saw that it
like
was
direct action, anti-fascism in direct action,
and that we outnumber these guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
They are the intruders.
Absolutely,
we can expel them.
This is our scene.
Right.
They want to try to like. At that time, the sort of right-wing neo-Nazi strategy was to try to infiltrate these places like the punk and metal scenes because they wanted to try to get sort of impressionable young guys who were kind of misfits and maybe didn't have much parenting and whatnot. And they figured it was fertile ground for it. And so they were like, okay, well, we'll join into the punk and metal scene. You notice they've totally abandoned that because that strategy failed for them. It really did, largely. And, ever since now they go to the whole Proud Boy bullshit, which is where they've got, these guys walking around in polo shirts and khakis trying to be scary. And it's laughable, frankly. But anyway, that was a really different time because, I had never seen anything like that. And I was, at that time, I think that was our sophomore year in high school. I think I was 15 years old. Well, so maybe 16.
It was like, no, because I want to say, I think it was 88, 89.
Okay.
We were 16 or 17.
It was probably 88.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I was a young kid really, and I had never seen anything like that.
Yeah.
And that was honestly, I think that show was one of the first, like I guess, real underground shows that I went to.
Okay.
You know, like that was like I had seen some of the bigger bands by that point. Like I had seen, some glam. I had been to Megadeth, but even by comparison, Megadeth was fairly mainstream at that point.
Yeah.
Right. But like I had seen Dio.
Yeah.
But I hadn't really been to like a small venue underground show that was like that.
Yeah, and the Aslan was definitely kind of sketchy back
Yeah,
then, too.
and it was kind of sketchy, and also we had a different experience of it too, because they had a local band that opened up that I also want to give a shout out to. It was a local kind of I guess they were a straight edge band. Keep in mind. Yeah. And they were friends of ours, and we, I think, just helped them load in, and they let us, because they were our buddies,
right?
And they let us like watch the show from the wings.
That's
so
correct.
we stood on stage,
yeah.
And the Aslan was one of those old movie palaces that was from like probably the turn of the century, and I think it's still there, but it's derelict.
Yeah, I don't know if they do shows there.
I think the building is basically condemned. It's not in good shape. But in any case, yeah, so we're standing on the stage watching this show. So that was the other thing that made that show really memorable to me. It was like, it felt like I was not just some fan in the crowd. Like we were there watching our friends play,
right? And
then Brotherhood came on, and then they beat up the Nazis, and then continued their set, and then we watched The Accused, and we were just like, "Well, that was so fucking cool."
And we got to talk and interact with these people.
Yeah, right.
There wasn't a barrier of rock stardom or of untouchability. They seemed like us. And we could just
they were
talk to them.
They were just like us. And that's one of the things that's come up on this show several times that I want to highlight again, is that one of the things that's I think is so cool about the sort of layer of the underground metal scene that I've loved for so many years is that there is no meaningful distinction between like musician and fan, right? Just everybody who's at the show, whether they're going to play on stage or not, is a fan of this scene.
Yeah.
And so, you can be chatting with somebody and then 20 minutes later see them on stage playing with their band.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't know. I can't think of another thing that's like this, because in so much of popular culture, there's such a huge divide between the audience and the performer.
Yep.
And that never the twain shall meet, right? It's the whole experience is gatekept from the fans.
Yeah.
And what I love about our scene is that even all these years on, we've been at this for 40 years now almost. Should we even say that? But what I love about this is that really hasn't changed.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not a gate-kept experience for the most part.
No. And I think when you are a veteran, that's kind of your expectation too, right? That when you do see the attempts at rock stardom in the underground scene, they seem laughable, because when you understand from where this stuff comes, that to act like that and to take that kind of take on that air
of like I'm too cool for you.
Yeah, like how ludicrous this is, because at the end of the day, this stuff is kind of silly, right? I love metal and I love the aesthetics of this stuff and everything about it, but subjectively, or I guess objectively, it's just kind of ridiculous when you look at it as a normal person with no frame of reference for this stuff comes to it and sees it. They're going to think, "Oh my God, this is ridiculous. This is a bunch of guys, pantomiming something."
Right.
It's like performance art. It's like some high concept, but this is ludicrous. Like it's essentially, or, like nerds really involved in Dungeons and Dragons. It's just,
it's objectively weird.
Yeah. Cool if it's your thing. But yeah, when you looked at it from a more mainstream lens, it comes across as kind of cartoonish. And I recognize that. And I think that I've always, though, gravitated towards artists and people who recognize that. That this is ridiculous.
Right.
But it's also awesome.
Right.
And so they are able to capture those two things and to have a sort of a sense of humor about themselves and not take themselves too seriously, but to take their craft very seriously, and I think those are the people to whom I gravitate the most, is who get that.
Yeah, I had seen this. You reminded me of this video that I saw earlier this week where it was from the recent Cannibal Corpse tour, and somebody was like right up, basically on the rail, and the video is so in the background you can see they're about to play "I Come Blood," which is of course one of the signature Cannibal Corpse songs, right?
Yes.
So Corpse Grinder, always gets up there and he talks for a minute or two, and then he always says, this song is about shooting blood from your cock, right? and it's absurd, right? It's totally silly, right? To think about this, like, just, it's ridiculous. But the people whoever it was that videoed this. Yes, you can see Corpse Grinder in the background, but they focused the video on the security guys between the rail and the stage,
Right.
who are looking back at the crowd. And these are guys who are, in most cases, not fans of whatever's on stage.
Correct.
And so just the expressions, these two guys start looking at each other when they hear him, because they're listening, they're watching the crowd, right? But they're listening to what he's saying and how he's saying it.
Right.
And they're just like, and anybody who's seen Cannibal Corpse knows exactly how he sounds when he says this. It was just seeing the look on these guys' faces. It was exactly what you just described. This is objectively absurd.
Yeah.
It is so funny.
Right. And that people would take it seriously,
Yeah, these guys are standing there and they're just completely like, I can't believe that there's like 1,000 people in this room who are hanging on this guy's every word. Like, this is fucking bizarre.
And I think that ridiculousness, that evil, the all of it, the contradictory and often self-contradictory nature of the thing just makes me love it more. I guess that a lot of this stuff it's pretty complicated. In terms of art, it's transgressive, or should be, but also borderline ridiculous. That I was sometimes I sympathize, I suppose, with people who find this stuff totally objectionable and ridiculous or even evil and corrupting. I could see on a surface level, I suppose, how one could get there, but at the same time, that's part of the appeal for me, I think, is that puerile type of like this is, it feels naughty. And maybe that goes back to, my youth when I discovered this stuff, that it felt like some of this stuff was probably stuff I felt like I wasn't supposed to listen to. Not because my parents ever put any of those, strictures or those limitations on me. That's absolutely not the case. But I think just being conditioned to think that this is this is really bad, this is inappropriate, but this is really exciting. And I think that has carried through to that's kept my interest in this thing. That's always been an aspect of extreme music that has appealed to me, frankly.
Yeah, it's like you almost feel like you're getting away with something.
Yeah, totally.
And that's part of the appeal. And it is funny because I know that there's plenty of people who, in my sort of social circle, it's like, yes, I have a bunch of friends who are metalheads, but I also have a bunch of friends who don't know anything about metal.
Sure.
And it's interesting to see them sort of experience little pieces of it through me, and like they'll see me like show up at like a Friday night dinner or something wearing some offensive death metal t-shirt, and they're like, well, here he is again. And they just go, well, that's just who he is, and it's fine. It just, I don't know, it just cracks me up because
but it's healthy to, I think, interact with what I would call the normal world, normal people,
for sure,
because when those of us who are really involved in this stuff kind of get desensitized to how extreme a lot of this stuff is. And that, again, when you are around people with no frame of reference for this stuff, it's a matter of first import for them. It's, that's a tough hill to climb, or a big barrier to entry, I would say, for most people, because this stuff is very off-putting. And I think that deliberately so. It's designed in a way that says this isn't for you. And I think that was another aspect, and not, I'm not into gatekeeping at all, but I think one aspect that I have to admit appeals to me about extreme music is that idea of this isn't for you.
Yeah.
Or you either know if it's for you or if it's not. And
Right.
the most people, when they look at the imagery, the iconography, they hear the sound, it's deliberately off-putting and it repulsive. And so it appeals to a very select group of people. And I think that the people to whom it appeals, who think that they're somehow elite because they understand that this stuff, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I do like, I have to, if I'm being honest, the off-putting aspect of, I guess, complicated art generally, or difficult art, that stuff that is just, it's done for the pure love of the thing, because there's no, it has no chance of commercial success. It's not designed for that, and has no aspirations towards that. But it comes from a place of love, from a place of passion. And for a certain group of people, it ends up being very important for them. Now, some of those artists who go on this really difficult path, I think, end up being really successful somehow, against all odds. But they don't do it because they set out to do that. They set out to be successful. They got really good at what they did. And for, whatever reason, right time, right place, the milieu, whatever, it works. But generally, this stuff is done by people who just love doing it and can't imagine their lives without doing it. And I love that. It's art for art's sake. When talking about musical development and journey and everything, I think I would have to also bring up, how important I think college was for me, and particularly where I went to college. And, I had been aware of, different things that weren't necessarily heavy metal that ended up being heavy. And I remember one of the first real fanzines I discovered was actually on a school trip in San Diego. And I got to go to a Tower Records, just walk there from the hotel, and I discovered this magazine called Sheet Metal, or a zine called Sheet Metal that Tower was selling. And it was just cool to me that there were these, sort of fans doing their own thing, just like, musicians were, and writing about the bands about which they cared. And that's when they had this section of the magazine about bands that were heavy that weren't necessarily metal. And that's where I discovered Soundgarden and Mudhoney. It ended up being important bands for me. And then that was, shortly a few years before I got to college. And I was at college at Oberlin in Northeast Ohio, and Cleveland had a fantastic music scene and really diverse, great metal scene, but also just Cleveland has always had this weirdo outsider streak, and there's lots of odd music and odd art that's come out of Cleveland. And so to be in that environment and to be around really when, lots of weird, great alternative rock was and heavy alternative stuff was brewing. And then, Nevermind hit. And obviously there was a sea change, but it was fun to be at school when Nevermind, opened the floodgates to major labels trying to discover the next Nirvana. So they would sign every single alternative band out there in hopes that one of these odd bands would sort of, they could capture lightning in a bottle again.
It was like a hedge fund, basically, for music.
It was so bizarre because, those of us who were paying attention when like the Butthole Surfers got signed.
Yeah.
We were thinking, they know they know what this band does, right? I mean, like the Butthole Surfers were notorious drug addicts and were totally unreliable. And you just give them all this cash and it was just, okay.
It was a disaster waiting to happen.
And they ended up writing Pepper, which was obviously their most successful song. And I guess, they took the task seriously as far as the Butthole Surfers can take the task seriously. But also like the Melvins, that was another example of a band that I thought was just so unapproachably weird and had such a contrarian streak that to get signed by Atlantic was bananas. Because, the Melvins would just release albums of noise just to upset people. And
because they could.
Right. And then just to give them a bunch of money, seemed like a bad idea.
Right.
But, again, they took it seriously. And I think their best albums are probably those 3 albums they did on Atlantic. But to be in college when all this stuff was happening and to see that develop and, and death metal really exploded in the early 90s too. So that was a really exciting, almost febrile time to be involved in extreme music because there was so much happening. And I think fortunately having that relationship with Matt, and he had started Relapse, and, he regularly sent me music when I was in college. And that was a wonderful way to keep in touch with, what was next, essentially, I think, in extreme music. And I would say, again, early Relapses, it's hard to overstate how important, that label was for the development of extreme music.
Oh, for sure.
And, and Matt's vision for that. And then also just the sense of pride, right? I had that, this is our friend. This is our bandmate.
We were in a band with
the kid with whom we played at my parents' garage, done well. So yeah, college was definitely another important step in sort of my musical journey, because also the bands I was playing in college, people weren't really into metal at Oberlin. They were into this weirdo outsider heavy stuff. And so those ended up being the bands I played in.
Right.
Just more of that alternative rock, like AmRep pigfuck type thing. And I still listen to that stuff to this day. And that's another one of those genres I totally track and hunt that stuff down,
right.
On record to this day. It ended up being really important to me.
I guess I don't even know, like, how many different bands were you in college?
There were really two of note, I would say. The first was Flat Rabbit, and that was more, I guess for lack of a better term, it was pretty jangly. Like, it was not that heavy, but definitely, informed by what was going on in grunge. But I think that, the guys with whom I was playing, they had interests that were just different than mine. And that was great from the point of view of learning new ways of expressing, myself musically and new avenues. But it wasn't quite what I wanted. It didn't scratch that itch. But the second band, Thigh Master, which then became Thigh Masterson due to cease and desist letter from Suzanne Summers' company.
This happens.
That band was heavier and more, I think that I had a lot of influence on the writing of those songs and sort of taught those guys how to play metal. But it was like metal by short-haired indie rock dudes, right?
Yeah.
So it was in the 90s, the early 90s. So it wasn't going to sound, like metal, but more coming at from that angle of
hard alt
the Jesus Lizard or Helmet or something.
Yeah, right.
Like that.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah. Did it sound like Helmet? Because
in aspects, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And then later you were in another band, Painstake.
Yeah, Painstake was the straight edge hardcore band I joined in '96, and they had a record deal by the time I joined. I had graduated from college. I was living in back in Colorado, gotten into law school. I deferred. I was teaching at our alma mater, and I had been, I hadn't been super involved in the straight edge hardcore scene at that point, but I remember I was snowboarding actually up at Loveland, and in the lift line in front of me on this guy had on his snowboard this sticker that said Painstake and had two, X's on each side, and said Colorado Straight Edge. And I was like, oh, it's still a thing here.
Yeah.
And I started then, I guess, Kissman or whatever, it saw some flyers for Painstake shows. So I saw 3 Painstake shows that summer, 95. And at the third one in Pueblo, the bassist, Tom Gann, introduced himself to me. We struck up a conversation about music, and at some point I mentioned that I was a drummer, and he said that, well, keep this on the down low, but we're kind of having some issues with our drummer right now. So, we'd love to get somebody else in there. And I said, I should drum for you guys. And I remember I actually met the other guys. I never tried out for that band.
Yeah.
They just met me and they're like, yeah, this will work. And they fired their drummer, and I became the drummer of Painstake. So I recorded, an album with them. We toured bunch, and that was fun. I mean, that was really my first experience with more extensive touring.
Yeah. I mean, that was a real band. Like,
Yeah, it was a real band.
Like our band in high school was not a real
Yeah,
band.
yeah, like with records in stores and
Yeah, right.
And you know, and it was one of those things that would blow me away, you know, being in, say, Louisville, Kentucky, playing in front of 500 kids who were going nuts and beating the shit out of each other. And then all these kids in the front row pointing and screaming all the lyrics to our songs. And I didn't know the lyrics to our songs. Right. So that was kind of a crazy feeling. Like, wow, these kids mean something to them. They're really into this.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and ultimately, you know, we broke up, you know, thousands of dollars of debt into our record label, as I guess any good indie band should. You know, went our separate ways. But yeah, I still have great relationships with those guys. And I think if I were to ever play in a band again, it would probably have to be with those guys, because it was just more than the songs we were playing. It was that camaraderie of being with those guys playing those songs. And because we had been together on tour, and we had some tough times on tour, you know, and I became very aware of why bands break up on tour all the time. Mm-hmm. And to our credit, we didn't.
Right.
You know, we definitely went through some rough shit on tour, but we stuck together. And I think that has a lot to do with the relationships I maintain with those guys. You know, to this day, when you're in the shit together, it really strengthens that bond. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and Painstake, you know, nothing but you know, fond memories of those times.
That's awesome. I kind of want to go out on a limb a little bit and talk about Straight Edge for a couple minutes, because you know, referencing the earlier part of the conversation where we talked about the Brotherhood show and how important that was. And that was like, I think for you and for me too, it was sort of the first exposure to Straight Edge. Yep. And I remember being really into the Straight Edge thing for a couple years. And then I just suddenly sort of wasn't. I like, you know, after high school, I went off to college, and then I was just like, this is not my thing anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think part of the reason that I got a little disillusioned with Straight Edge was because right around that time, right around late 1990, early 1991, I started picking up on this sort of vibe in the Straight Edge scene where one of the things I liked about Straight Edge at the time was it felt very like, it felt ideologically aligned with where I was at. Like, it was all about, like you said, we keep it positive. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the whole Youth Crew thing, Gorilla Biscuits, Judge, although Judge I sort of put in a different category, but Gorilla Biscuits, Youth of Today, Bold, like Instead, those bands were like super important. We saw a lot of those bands at like tiny little venues at that time. And that was really awesome. Like seeing a band like Uniform Choice in what essentially was a coffee house. Was like one of my favorite concert memories. I still remember that show very vividly.
Reason to Believe in Uniform Choice was huge.
That was an incredible show. Yeah. And so I was really into that stuff at the time. And I think in a weird way, Judge was one of the first bands, but also that started to get me sort of feeling weird about Straight Edge.
Well, there was a darkness.
And this is like, I guess what I'm getting at and what I want to explore with you is that I started feeling like, especially with bands like Slapshot, who on some level I really loved their whole thing and how like aggressive and thuggish. I don't know, it's very thuggish and very like, you know, today I would sort of call it sort of very toxically masculine.
Well, yeah, and I think accurately I would say it's very Boston.
Yeah.
They were like one of the most Boston bands ever.
For sure.
And if somebody has been to Boston, they will understand, I think, where
and like particular neighborhoods,
white male aggression comes from.
Right, in particular neighborhoods in Boston, especially. So, you know, Slapshot was in that, but there was also what there started to. I started to pick up on this vibe in the Straight Edge scene was that it started to feel, because up until that point we were standing against like the neo-Nazi thing that was going on with the skinheads. Like very much the Straight Edge kids were like politically left. Yeah,
it's a punk rock movement, and I think politically a lot of that stuff comes from the left.
Right, it comes from the left, and it was anti-fascist. Yep, and it was like very inclusive, and we were all about like taking care of the scene and taking care of each other. So in that sense, it was communist, it was anarchist, in that sense, in a weird way. But what ended up
wholesome too,
very wholesome.
Yeah.
But what also ended up happening was that I feel like there was this strain of Straight Edge that became very authoritarian. And started to kind of flirt with I'm sort of very averse to anything authoritarian, whether it's left or right. But I feel like what started to happen was that straight edge started to become very exclusive.
Oh yeah.
And it was like, if you've got a beer in your hand, you're like a horrible piece of shit. And you deserve to get the shit beat out of you.
Well, and that idea, and
that didn't square with me.
You would see
that's why I left.
Right. You would see it on shirts. If you're not now, you never were.
Right.
And so, yeah, I claimed edge really when it was in that positive stage.
Yeah, like the late 80s youth crew movement.
And yeah, I'd say Judge was the band that introduced this element of darkness, of
and musically, Judge was really thrashy though too.
They were pretty metal, but I think that also Judge now, and then I look back, having spent a fair amount of time in the hardcore scene, hardcore had a lot of like really fucked up kids in it. And, I grew up in a very safe, nurturing, positive environment, and my parents were very supportive of all the things that I did. And some of my bandmates were not so fortunate, and they came from incredibly difficult situations and far less, fortunate than I was. And in terms of just being able to trust other people and to have the ability to even, things that I would take for granted in terms of human interaction.
Right.
They just didn't have those skills. They weren't equipped with that because they were just worried about survival.
Yeah.
And they were in a very different place. We ended up in the same place eventually, but they got there through, far different life experiences. And I think Judge was one of those bands that for me, I guess brought, not at the time, but when I look back, that was my first introduction to sort of a really fucked up kid pouring his heart out into what he was doing. And that's Mike Judge. And like Mike grew up rough. And that's reflected in the lyrics. And then that was also reflected, I think, in his general demeanor. Like he was sort of this guy he was the guy who would always fight the skinheads. And it became this legend in the scene, that he was going to come to some town and beat all the skinheads up and drive them out of town and stuff. And it became this legend. Like
he's like some sort of hardcore Pied Piper.
Exactly. He couldn't even live up to that. And I think that he ultimately became disillusioned with that. And he dropped out of hardcore and sort of dropped out of everything. He was a weird hermit for forever until I think the rest of the guys were able to convince him to come back. And I got to see Judge on their first reunion tour in Germany when I lived there. And that was really cool. It's sort of a full circle moment for me. But where I was going with this is that when you have sort of this island of misfit toys, right? All these fucked up kids all in one scene, you get these weird ideas. And so among those weird ideas was this notion of hardline. And so hardline was an offshoot of straight edge that I became aware of, I want to say like mid-90s, maybe before I joined Painstake. I was definitely aware. I mean, there was, Earth Crisis they were already a pretty popular band by that time. They had the Firestorm EP on Victory, but they get called like a militant straight edge band. But I think that what I'm thinking of is more like Raid or Vegan Reich. These were these bands that took this very militant and in many regards a very right-wing fascist almost approach to the world and to politics, that all life was to be protected no matter the cost. And so I first became aware of, straight edge started for me with No Drinking, No Drugs, right?
Right.
And I think Youth of Today was the first band I remember talking about vegetarianism. And I'm sure there were others, but that for me, that was it. And then Hardline took that vegetarian message to this sort of extreme where, fur farms were to be burned down and fur stores were to be destroyed and slaughterhouses were to be burned and there's sort of this direct action idea. And the odd thing I remember in the mid-90s was being at hardcore shows and where hardline bands would be playing, and there would be all these pamphlets amongst all the zines and everything for like from Operation Rescue or Focus on the Family, these anti-abortion pamphlets and all this other nonsense that I thought had no place in punk rock, because again, essentially a left-wing musical movement that then is now embracing these odd, very out there, far right ideas.
And I sort of wonder, was
religious almost,
was it embracing those ideas, or was it getting co-opted by the sort of,
well, I think like hardcore
going both ways.
And it's funny because the hardcore scene in many regards is very conservative in terms of, the way I think people dressed and just like haircuts and the appearance. I think there wasn't a lot of tolerance for, people who looked different. And
there's definitely a look.
Yeah, there was absolutely a look at hardcore shows, in the 90s. I mean, that's changed for the better, I think. But in the 90s, there was very much a uniform, and it was a very conservative, very rote scene. That was, I think, a problem maybe that Painstake had, is that we were not that band.
Right.
And I think that we had been pigeonholed as some kind of militant straight edge band. I think that at that point, all of us weren't even straight edge anymore. We were never one of those bands that sang about straight edge.
Right.
We just happened to be straight edge dudes in a band, so we were a straight edge band. But a lot of this came to a head, I think, for us when the first time we ever played in Salt Lake City. So we had heard that the Salt Lake City scene was pretty violent, and there were a lot of militant kids there. But it was also a really big scene, and it was not that far from Denver. So
they made a movie about it.
Yeah, so we were able to, drive there. We stayed with one of the local kids.
And this is late 90s, right? This is like 96, 97.
Yeah. 96, I think, was the first time we played in Salt Lake. And so, remember, we went out to breakfast at Denny's with some of these local kids, hardcore kids. I think these kids were so excited to meet us, and they were a little younger than us. And I remember the looks of disappointment on their faces when we were at Denny's and we ordered, like moons over my hammy or something, and we were eating meat. And they just seemed crushed that we would, that Painstake, these model militant straight edge vegan warriors were going to eat meat. And I was never a vegetarian later in life, but or a vegan, and never claimed to be such. And I think maybe, again, some of my bandmates were, but it wasn't a unifying theme for us. But these kids were so let down. Like their heroes had disappointed them. And it kind of, we were starting to get these weird vibes. And at that show that night, we played at this place, Club Deviate, in this basement. There were a lot of kids at this show. I mean, 500 or something stuffed into this basement. I remember we started playing, and it was crazy. They were going nuts. It's one of the best crowd reactions we ever had. But at some point, and this was relayed to me because, I'm behind the drums, I can't see this happening. Some dude in the back was smoking weed, and I guess he got surrounded by 8 or 10 of these militant thugs. And they just
hardline kids.
Though. Yeah, hardline kids. Yeah. And they beat this guy down, apparently, and beat him up so badly that they turned the house lights on, and paramedics came down with a stretcher and put this guy on the stretcher and carried him out. And we were pretty stunned. We hadn't seen anything like this at a show. And then the power came back on, though, and so we just started playing again. The lights were on, but then we were playing. But then, so the lights went off. We started playing again. I guess these kids had moved near the front of the stage, and they were arguing with some kid like stage right. And I think this kid's girlfriend was standing on a box watching us, and the militant kids ended up, wrestling or jostling with this kid, and it hit into the box and knocked this girl off, and she hit her head on the ground, and I guess was convulsing in the whole nine. Just a terrible scene. So the lights come back on, they cut the power, the paramedics come back in, they take this girl out, and that's like the end of the show. And so our singer, Max, said, this is so fucking dumb. You kids keep this up, there's not going to be a scene here.
Yeah.
And then in a scene that must have been, reminiscent of Nazi Germany, about 20 of these kids rushed the stage, and they were all pointing and yelling at us. and it was a little frightening. But then they were like quoting lyrics from Raid songs and stuff. They were like, "I won't unite with what I despise," and you're just yelling all these slogans at us, and we were like, "This is so bizarre." And so one of our guitarists, Jay, grabbed the microphone. He goes, "You know what, you guys? It's called college. You're going to go there and none of this shit's going to matter. You're all going to be drunk anyway." And they didn't think that was very funny. And so they wanted to fight us. Like, we were all pretty big dudes, but there were, I don't know, there could have been, I have no idea how many of these kids were waiting for us in the parking lot, and they could have been armed. I don't know. They were carrying knives. Yeah. I'd heard the kids had been stabbed, at shows in Salt Lake. So I wasn't eager to find out, get stabbed by all these vegan straight edge warriors. We waited in the venue for a while. I guess that they dispersed, but it was just so bizarre, right? This was like hardcore shows for me were always these sources of incredible energy and positivity. And I felt alive, and I felt that I think, as much as I love
lots of catharsis,
extreme metal and stuff, there's nothing like the energy of a hardcore show. And that positivity and how that feels. And this was not that. This went in a much darker direction. And I remember we played another show at Salt Lake that was similarly violent, but not quite as, dangerous. But I think that some of those kids ended up getting arrested for various crimes, like they tried to burn down a McDonald's, some of them. And just, again, very bizarre. Any of the interactions I had, not just in Salt Lake, but on tour with other hardline types, just made me wonder, what happens? How do these kids get involved in this stuff? And I think ultimately what it is they're searching, right? They're fucked up kids searching for meaning, searching for a purpose, and hardline has these strict rules and this order and the way things are supposed to be, and it's exciting. And I think it's transgressive in the way that in the sense that it's in this punk framework, but you're being, you're sort of pushing against that of what the traditional idea of punk rock is, or even what the traditional idea of straight edge is,
which is almost laughable on its face if you think about it.
It is, because again, these are such small scenes,
right?
Like these micro genres that suddenly people take so seriously and police.
Yeah.
And I will say, as an outsider now, and way away from my hardcore band days, I like going back and exploring sort of that tough, the militant straight edge scene in terms of, going back to explore some of the releases, but also what was going on at the time. Because in a way, it reminds me of what was going on in Norway in the early 90s with black metal.
Yeah,
I think there are a lot of parallels between the scenes, in that you have this fanaticism, almost religious, in the sense of the way that the Norwegians were burning down churches, and that these straight edge kids were burning down fur farms or McDonald's or whatever. But that this almost slavish devotion to this idea, or your anti whatever, God, or
it's some sort of devotion to
fur
purity
industry. But this search for purity,
yeah,
and this belief in like that you're elite somehow because you've transcended the normal, be it death metal or regular straight edge, whatever it is. But it's interesting to me, I guess, from a sociological perspective, looking back on it. And there was definitely some good music that came out of that period, but I think that it's the imagery and the notoriety around it that makes it almost more interesting than music, be it militant straight edge or the Norwegian black metal, that there's a sensational aspect to it that I find intriguing. But there are definitely parallels between the two scenes.
Yeah, I kind of wonder, the thing about the Norwegian black metal scene that's so amusing to me now is just how much lore there is around like these individual personalities and their relationships with each other, and then the things that they did and the places they went. And, it's like, you can't nobody can go to, no metalhead can go to Norway without like trying to go get their picture taken in the basement of that building.
Helvete, yeah.
It's just one of these things. Like,
Well, yeah, black metal tourism, yeah.
yeah, it is. It's black metal tourism. And so I wonder, like, there's probably some similar lore in the militant hardcore scene. But I wanted to ask you about that just because, so I'm glad you were able to talk about that, because it was something, by the time you had gotten so deep into hardcore, especially in straight edge, I had kind of moved on to other things. So I didn't know that much about that stuff. And I just knew that in the early inklings of that, where I felt like it was starting to feel kind of authoritarian, was when I got kind of repulsed by it and was like, I'm kind of out. I'm done.
Well, and I'll admit there's maybe it's the jock in me, but there's something appealing to me about ignorant hardcore and about moshing and about the dumb riffs played slowly that are just meant to inspire violence.
Yeah.
And it's dumb and it's totally regressive, but there's something about it that appeals to me. Now, I think, my favorite hardcore bands or bands that were hardcore adjacent were definitely the smarter ones and did something with it.
Yeah.
But I'm always going to have this reptilian attraction to just big dumb riffs.
Well, and I think this is the way I want to bring this back full circle, and to sort of close this off, because I kind of want to start heading towards a finale here.
Okay.
But I want to wrap that hardcore thing around back to a conversation we had the other night when you were over for dinner.
Okay.
Where we talked about power violence.
Yeah.
And how, pick a band, but like take a band like we talked about Weekend Nachos.
Yep.
I saw Weekend Nachos at Northwest Terrorfest earlier this year, and I had never seen them before. And holy shit, I was so impressed.
So good.
And when I first heard about them, I'm like, what are they doing playing a metal festival? So, connect those dots for me. Like,
sure.
How do we get from death metal to hardcore to power violence to it belonging in the metal scene again?
So I think one thing that's always appealed to me about power violence particularly is I think there are a lot of dudes that are kind of odd ducks, I guess, like me.
Yeah.
In the sense of they're into lots of different things and they don't quite, I guess, feel like they fit neatly in any particular category. And so the Weekend Nachos guys, for example, I think that those are guys who genuinely love metal and big, dumb, ignorant aspects of hardcore, but they're very clever guys. They're very funny and they're very self-aware. And I think it's demonstrated even just by their name, Weekend Nachos. It's a ridiculous name, but they play this super brutal music, but the lyrics are very clever. And they often skewer a lot of the sacred cows, I think, of hardcore or of extreme music. And they go after a lot of things that I think that with which, the true punks would agree. But because of the way they look, because of the manner in which they present their music, they don't really get accepted by the true punk crowd, and they're regarded. And so there was this derisive term for Weekend Nachos early in their career, jock power violence. And they took that and they owned that. And they even made merch then that would have a football and say jock power violence on it as a reclaiming that. And I think that was hilarious. They always had a wonderful sense of their place in the universe and just a really great sense of humor about the whole thing. That, again, to my point about they fully understand how ridiculous all of this is, but it's also awesome. And
right.
They are the absolute, maybe they might be the pinnacle, I think, of that idea of this dichotomy between, is this band really playing it straight, like with that name? But you listen to them and they're so good. But
and you almost wonder, as an audience member, like, are they making fun of me?
Totally. Is this a parody?
Yeah.
Like, are they mocking me? And
am I in on the joke?
Yeah.
Am I part of the joke?
Yeah.
Am I the joke?
I love that wink, wink, nudge, nudge element of it. And I think power violence, maybe more than any other subgenre in extreme music, is full of bands like that really get it.
Yeah.
I think that understand the laughable and the wonderful aspects of this whole extreme music thing. And I think the power violence bands that do it really well, they're wonderful to behold because it's just this full realization of all that extreme music I think has to offer.
Yeah, the other band in that genre that we talked about the other night that I really want to give a shout out to that was just blew me away was Brat.
Yeah.
And they go even further into say, this is bimbo violence.
Right,
is what
right.
they call their genre. But yeah, I mean, it's everything from it's from the look of the band,
Yeah.
to the sound of the band, to the merch,
Yeah.
to just everything about them. It's just, there's a layer of absurdity that is like shellacked very thickly on top of everything else.
Well, and I think also Brat is important in terms of representation, not just because it's a woman. I mean, there are plenty of bands that have women singing for them,
Right?
But I think that the manner in which the vocalist for Brat presents herself, and with the blonde hair and the makeup and this specific look, is fantastic given how they sound. And, that you would absolutely not accuse this band of being tourists. Like they're totally legit. And if you've seen
100%.
them play, they're just like, they rule. And I think another band I would bring up along those lines is Escuela Grind.
Yeah.
That, another really important band in terms of representation, but also just kicking ass and, being representative or breaking the idea of, this white male dominated genre,
Yeah.
or scene. Bands like that are wonderful, incredibly important.
Yeah. Yeah. I want you to tell me the name of, give me an album
Okay.
that you have discovered in the last year
Okay.
that is not a metal album.
Okay.
And, tell me something that you like, an album that you were like, this album rules. I love this. I mean, this could be a pop album, a jazz album, a blues album.
I think that it would be Cigarettes After Sex. I think that's an artist, a band that captured such a mood and a vibe for me that I ended up listening to just a bunch. And I'm blowing it on the name. Is it X's or I don't remember. So I think by this point, Cigarettes After Sex has 3 albums. So they're a band from El Paso.
Mm-hmm.
The singer has this very androgynous voice. And most people for whom I've played Cigarettes After Sex presume it's a woman singing.
Mm-hmm.
But they sound to me like what Brooklyn, I guess, feels like.
Mm-hmm.
But again, they're from El Paso. But there's a wonderful atmosphere they're able to conjure that is dark. It's not heavy at all by any stretch of the imagination. It's very sparse music, and there are very few notes. But it's what they do with those notes and then the space between those notes that they're a fascinating band to me. And I get excited every time, I see a mention of Cigarettes After Sex in the media, or hear other, artists that I like talking about them, or when they're, and they're not an unknown band by any means. I mean, they're pretty popular these days.
Yeah.
I certainly think when they play shows, they probably do pretty well, play in pretty decent sized venues. But when I discovered them, I want to say it was like 2019 when they first came on my radar. It was just such a breath of, fresh air. Not that I was, seeking something different or wanted something different, but it spoke to me. And it wasn't like a lot of things, that I've alluded to in this discussion we're having about, making the hair stand up in the back of my neck and immediately hitting me. It was more of a slow burn.
Yeah.
And I think that that's appropriate with what their music is.
Yeah.
It's a slow burn. It's this simmering, it's really anthems about relationships and maybe a discomfort in relationships or discomfort with one's own place in the world. Whatever it is, I am awfully fond of Cigarettes After Sex.
Great. Dude, thank you for this time and for participating in this project. I feel like this is a little bit overdue, but we don't get opportunities to sit in the same room very often.
We do not.
So I'm glad we get to do this. So thank you. It's been really a lot of fun.
And thank you. I really simply love talking with people who are knowledgeable and passionate about the stuff that I care about. So always a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, man. Hey, I hope you enjoyed the first official episode of Season 2 of the Metal Gateway podcast. More episodes are coming soon. This podcast is a production of Studio Portcullis. Our theme music is by Tauntaun. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. If you are feeling extra generous, please leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice. Reviews really help other people to find the show. If you have comments or questions or suggestions for guests you'd like to see on the show, please email them to metalgatewaypodcast@gmail.com, or you can slide into my DMs on Instagram @metalgateway. Thanks for listening, everybody. I'll talk to you soon.